Deep in the heart of Darke County, Ohio, nestled among the dense woods and winding trails, a young girl was born, one who would soon prove she was no ordinary child. This is where it all began, in a simple cabin tucked away in the wilderness. Life here was rugged, unforgiving, but it built strength, resilience. In a home like this, survival depended on skill, on the keen eye of a hunter, the steady hand on a rifle. These were the lessons passed down from father to daughter, and in that home, among the towering trees and whispering winds, a little girl named Phoebe Ann Moses, who the world would one day call Annie Oakley, began her journey. Her story, however, didn't start with her. It was written in the footsteps of those before her. Like her father, Jacob Moses, a man who had once fought in the War of 1812, a man who knew battle, hardship, and sacrifice. But the greatest battle he would face wasn't on a battlefield. It was against the merciless grip of winter itself. Braving the bitter cold, he ventured into the storm, seeking supplies for his family. But the journey came at a terrible cost. Frostbite set in, pneumonia followed, and in 1866, when little Annie was just 6 years old, her father was gone. After her father passed away, the weight of survival felt heavy on her mother, Susan. Alone with too many mouths to feed and no steady income, she did all she could, but the burden was too great. In a moment of quiet heartbreak, Susan made an impossible choice. She brought little Annie to the county infirmary, a place where the forgotten were sent. The administrators there weren't kind. They were stern, cold, and Annie, barely a child, was handed off into their care. The building itself stood like a shadow on the land, gray, rigid, unfeeling inside. Rows of narrow beds with cold metal frames housed the orphaned, the abandoned, the mentally unwell, and children of families too poor to keep them. They worked hard, all of them, scrubbing floors on raw knees, hands blistered from the rough boards, barefoot and quiet. Childhood was traded for labor. Meals were simple bowls of thin porridge, served in silence, no comfort, no warmth. And at night, under the watchful eye of the stern administrator, the children laid still in their beds, the lights dimmed, the air heavy. For Annie it was a world of survival and silence. It was at the Darke County infirmary that Annie met the family she would only ever refer to as the Wolves. She never named them publicly. Some guessed the Booze family, others the Studebakers, but the truth remained locked in her silence. They came to her with a promise, education, shelter, a small coin for her trouble. She was just 9 years old and desperate. Mr. Wolfe, with a friendly face, extended the offer. His family had young children. They needed help, and Annie needed a way to survive. But what waited behind the door of that home was not kindness. Mrs. Wolfe ruled the household with cold eyes and a cruel heart. Annie was worked to the bone, scrubbing floors, hauling water, polishing until her fingers ached. Nothing she did was ever enough. When Annie displeased her, punishment came swiftly, locked in a cold, dark room without shoes, beaten with a switch. Scars she would carry, not just on her skin, but in her soul. Food was kept under lock and key, bread hidden away. Hunger became another form of control. And when Annie disobeyed, even slightly, she was thrown outside barefoot into the bitter frost, forced to sleep on the frozen ground, shivering, desperate and alone. She curled up against the door for warmth, hoping that even a hint of mercy that never came. Inside, life continued without her. She was invisible, forgotten. From the windows she would gaze toward the world beyond, longing for her mother, longing to go home, but escape was never allowed. Not until after 2 long years of silence and suffering. Annie finally ran. She took her chance, and she ran. Annie ran home, back to her mother, back to her family, but the shadows of poverty still hung heavy over the household. There was barely enough to eat. Survival, again, would demand something more. So Annie made a vow. She picked up her father's old rifle and held it with steady hands. If this was the only tool she had, she would master it. She would feed her family. Day after day she practiced, aiming, firing, learning to read the woods, to track, to hunt. She was a natural, a gift sharpened by necessity. Her mother at first worried that buckshot would ruin the meat or tear the pelts, but she quickly saw that Annie's aim was clean, precise, not a single shot wasted. The family began to eat well again. Stew simmered over the hearth. The house smelled of warmth, of food, of hope. And it didn't stop there. Annie began selling pelts to the local store. Her kills were so clean, so perfect. They were in high demand, especially with hotels and restaurants in nearby Cincinnati. Word spread fast. The best meat and the finest pelts came from a girl named Annie. By the age of 15, she did the unthinkable. She paid off the entire mortgage on her mother's home. A teenage girl with a rifle had secured her family's future. One day, a man named Jack Frost, owner of the local saloon, pulled Annie aside. He'd heard the stories. He knew her aim was legendary. He told her of a vaudeville show coming to town, and a sharpshooter named Frank Butler. Frank challenged men across the country to try and outshoot him. Almost no one ever came close, but Jack had a feeling. Annie entered the competition, quiet, calm, just 15 years old, and when the shots rang out, the men watched in silence, because one by one she outshot them all. When Annie met Frank Butler for the first time, something shifted. She looked into his eyes like she'd never seen eyes before, like the world had paused just for a moment. And for Frank, it was no different. They stepped onto the stage together, competitors side by side. Shot after shot rang out. Annie hit every single mark. Frank missed just one. He lowered his head, hand over his brow, not in shame but in disbelief. He'd never been beaten like that, especially not by a 15-year-old girl with a calm gaze and unshakable aim. But instead of walking away, he saw something greater. He invited Annie to join his act. Together they toured vaudeville circuits across the country. Town by town, show by show, they amazed audiences with every performance. Their routes crisscrossed the United States, long roads, endless nights, packed festivals, and through it all, their bond deepened. Frank was captivated not just by her skill, but by her strength, her spirit, her fire. And Annie couldn't take her eyes off of him. Their love grew quietly, naturally. What began as a match of marksmanship became something far more rare, a true partnership. On August 23, 1876, Annie Oakley and Frank Butler were married. It was a love built on admiration, a business built on brilliance, a story built on equal footing. She didn't just win the competition. She won his heart. In time, it became clear to everyone, including Frank, that Annie was the star. She stepped into the spotlight with grace, confidence, and unmatched skill, and Frank, rather than standing in her way, stepped back, proudly. He became her presenter, her manager, her support, because he knew the world needed to see her shine, and shine she did. But behind the scenes, away from the gunpowder and applause, their life was gentle. They treasured the quiet. Tea at home, peaceful afternoons reading the newspaper, simple moments that stitched their lives together just as tightly as their travels ever did. They made time for each other, not just in the bright lights of the vaudeville circus, but in the stillness between shows, because to them, love wasn't found in the spotlight. It was found in the silence. By 1884, Annie Oakley had her sights set on something bigger, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. It was the grandest stage of them all, a traveling spectacle that brought the legends of the frontier to life. But there was one problem. There was already a sharpshooter. Captain Adam Bogardus had long held the title, a master marksman, a respected name. There simply wasn't room for another. For a time, Annie had to watch from the sidelines, but fate had other plans. That year, Buffalo Bill's troupe was traveling down the Mississippi River by steamboat. The cast, the crew, the trick riders and sharpshooters, everyone aboard, but disaster struck. The river turned restless. The steamboat began to sink. One by one, the performers swam to shore. No lives were lost, but the damage was done. Captain Bogardus made it out safely, but his prized exhibition rifles, the very tools of his craft, sank to the depths of the Mississippi. And though his body survived the water, his balance did not. The river had robbed him of his equilibrium. With his performance affected, Bogardus stepped away from the show, and in that moment, a door opened. Annie Oakley and Frank Butler took their place in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. From that point forward, Annie wasn't just a performer. She was a legend in the making. Of all the legends Annie crossed paths with under Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, few left a mark as deep as Sitting Bull, a warrior, a chief, a survival of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He carried the spirit of his people with quiet power and steady eyes. And when he met Annie Oakley, he didn't see a performer. He didn't even see a girl. He saw a warrior. Her aim, her discipline, her resilience, these were not the qualities of a sideshow act. They were the marks of someone cut from the same cloth as those he had fought beside. He admired her not just for her skill, but for her courage, and in a rare personal gesture, he adopted her as his daughter, a profound sign of respect in Lakota culture. He gave her a name, Watanya Chichila, Little Sure Shot. It was more than a nickname. It was a title of honor. To Annie, this meant everything. Their bond wasn't made of words. It was forged in mutual respect. Sitting Bull presented her with a medallion, a personal token of admiration, and then something sacred, his moccasins, the very moccasins he had worn in battle when his people triumphed at Little Bighorn. He placed them in her hands, not as a gift, but as a symbol of trust, of legacy, of a warrior recognizing another. As Annie's legend grew, so did the spectacle. No longer just a girl with a rifle, she became a performer, an artist of the impossible. On horseback, she rode with poise and power, pulling off acrobatic feats while hitting every mark. The crowd roared. She once shot for food, now she shot for the thrill of the audience. At her side, a loyal poodle balanced an egg on its head, unbroken, untouched, until Annie's bullet cracked it with precision. Every shot was a show, every moment a marvel, and soon the show would cross the sea. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show set sail for Europe, carrying legends and icons across the Atlantic. Annie, Sitting Bull, and the rest of the cast prepared to show the world what the American West was made of. On board, Annie sat beside Sitting Bull, waiting for landfall. Two warriors, two worlds, one journey, and when they arrived, the world watched. Before long, Annie Oakley stood face to face with Queen Victoria. The Queen was captivated not just by Annie's skill, but by her grace, her presence. She called Annie a very clever little girl, a term of endearment that stuck in Annie's heart for years. Annie performed before royalty, her rifle in hand, standing tall in front of the world's most powerful. But even across the ocean, fame invited rivalry. Back in the United States, another name began to rise, Lillian Smith. Brash, bold, younger, she challenged Annie Oakley's title, claiming the spotlight for herself. The newspapers fed the fire, printing headlines that questioned Annie's place in the show. Lillian declared Annie's time was over, that her reign was done. But Annie didn't flinch. She didn't run. Still abroad, she continued her tour, now invited to perform before the German royal family. There in front of a packed court, the German prince stepped forward with a lit cigar in hand. Annie took aim, and in a flash the bullet flew. The cigar shot clean out of his fingers. A roar of awe filled the room. Annie Oakley had just answered her challengers without saying a single word. After the whirlwind tour of Europe, Annie returned to the United States, but so did her rivalry. The tension between Annie Oakley and Lillian Smith had grown too loud to ignore. Audiences demanded to know who was the true sharpshooter, who would hold the title of the best in the West. There was only one way to settle it, a public duel of precision. Two women, one stage, a contest that would decide it all. The shots rang out, one after another, and when the smoke cleared, it was Annie Oakley who stood victorious. Her arm was raised in triumph. The crowd roared. Lillian Smith, bold and brash, had been silenced not by insult, but by undeniable skill. She had eaten her words, and while her pride stung, she did what she had to do. She packed her suitcase and walked away. No tantrum, no fight, just a forward gaze, head held high, on to the next chapter of her life. But behind the scenes, a quiet decision had already been made. Annie had shown Buffalo Bill something deeper than skill. She had shown him that Lillian's arrogance didn't belong in the show's legacy. As a condition for the continuing with the Wild West show, Annie made it clear there would be no place for both of them. And Buffalo Bill chose loyalty, grace, and precision. He chose Annie Oakley. As Annie's fame grew, so did her sense of purpose. In 1898, with the Spanish-American War looming, she picked up her pen and wrote a bold letter to President William McKinley. In it, she made an extraordinary offer. She volunteered to raise a regiment of female sharpshooters to fight on the front lines, to serve their country, to show the world that women were just as capable in combat as men, and she wasn't bluffing. Annie began training women herself, teaching them how to aim, how to hold steady, how to be precise, focused, and fearless. She saw no reason why women should be denied the chance to serve, to defend, or to stand beside their brothers in battle. She believed in fairness, in courage, and in a woman's right to be seen as equal. President McKinley received her letter at the White House, and though he admired her bravery and respected her intentions, the answer was gentle but clear. The nation simply wasn't ready. Women would not serve on the battlefield, not yet. Still, Annie's voice had been heard, her courage noted, and her legacy, once built on perfect aim, was now also tied to something greater, a fight for equality, one that would take generations, but one that she never stopped believing in. In 1901, tragedy came not with a bullet, but with a train. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was on the move, traveling by rail in two separate trains. The conductor of a southbound train hauling manure had been warned. The Wild West troop would be passing through. He waited. He saw the first train pass. But what he didn't know, what no one made clear, was that a second train was coming, and with that misunderstanding, he pulled forward straight into his path. Two trains, one track. The collision was head-on. Wood and steel crumpled into chaos. Annie Oakley was among the injured. Thrown violently, she suffered severe spinal trauma, a shattered hand, and fractures in her legs. For a time she couldn't walk, and there were whispers, would she ever walk again? She was rushed to a makeshift medical car, surrounded by doctors and nurses tending to the wounded. Then came the journey south to a hospital in North Carolina, where her condition remained uncertain. She underwent surgery, her body broken but her spirit still holding on. Later, she was moved by train to New York, where better surgeons and cleaner, more advanced hospitals awaited her. She lay in a large state-of-the-art facility surrounded by white walls, polished tools, and expert hands. Still, the pain was constant. She wore a brace across her back and arm, confined to bed, her body still, her mind racing. First time in her life, Annie Oakley's future felt uncertain. But if anyone could rise from this, it was her. Annie Oakley did recover, slowly, painfully, but she returned. Not quite as she once was. No more trick shots from horseback, no more rapid-fire exhibitions. Her injuries had changed her, but they hadn't stopped her. Back in the spotlight of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, Annie took on a new role, one with less physical strain, but just as much power. She became an actress. In the stage production of The Western Girl, she captivated audiences once again, not with bullets this time, but with presence. She still wore the fringe, still stood tall in front of thousands, but now her weapon was storytelling, and still, the crowd loved her. In the early 1900s, Annie Oakley found herself facing a new kind of attack, this time not from a challenger, but from the press. At the center of it all stood William Randolph Hearst, the powerful media mogul who ran one of the largest newspaper empires in America. One of his papers printed a sensational story that Annie Oakley had been arrested for stealing men's trousers to support a cocaine habit. The woman at the heart of the scandal was a burlesque performer, who also went by the name Annie Oakley, though some said she spelled it A-N-Y, Oakley. Whether it was a coincidence, an alias, or a deliberate act, it didn't matter. The damage was done. The headline spread like wildfire. People assumed it was the Annie Oakley. The woman they had once cheered for on stage was now being whispered about in shame. But Annie refused to stay silent. She took a stand against William Randolph Hearst, and not just him, but dozens of other newspapers that had copied and spread the false report. She stood in front of boards of men, courtroom after courtroom, demanding her name be cleared, and she won. 54 out of 55 lawsuits. One victory alone awarded her $27,000, a fortune at the time, but after 4 years of legal battles and countless lawyer fees, she likely spent more than she earned. Because for Annie Oakley, it was never about the money. It was about her honor, her truth, and the right to protect the legacy she had spent a lifetime building. In her later years, Annie Oakley turned her spotlight towards service. She became a passionate fundraiser, especially for the military and wartime causes. One of her most memorable efforts was on behalf of the Red Cross. With a white donation box in hand, she stood tall before crowds and called them to action. Come and donate here. Support your boys fighting for your free country. But Annie, as always, knew how to make a moment unforgettable. By her side stood her beloved dog, Dave. Though history often describes him as an Irish setter, the truth didn't matter nearly as much as the bond they shared. In this case, Dave looked more like a golden retriever, but Annie didn't mind. She loved her animals fiercely, and Dave was more than a pet. He was a performer too. In the middle of her fundraising shows, Dave would trot through the crowd sniffing hands and handkerchiefs. When he found a hidden donation, he'd raise a paw and mark the giver, winning laughs, applause, and warm hearts. It wasn't just a show, it was Annie's way of connecting, of giving back, of reminding people that every dollar counted and that their soldiers needed them. She gave all she could, because for Annie Oakley, the fight for freedom didn't end on the battlefield. It continued in every heart and every home. In 1922, Annie and Frank were seen driving through the countryside in a luxurious Chrysler, her pale hand resting on the windowsill, the wind gently tugging at her hair. But not long after, tragedy struck again. Their car was involved in a serious accident. The details remain unclear, what caused the crash, or what exactly went wrong. But from that moment on, Annie's health began to decline rapidly. Some believed the lingering trauma from the train wreck years earlier had never fully healed. Others pointed to her severe anemia, which left her increasingly frail and weak. Whatever the cause, the final years of Annie Oakley's life were marked by pain, exhaustion, and quiet suffering. Frank remained faithfully by her side. Though her face still held traces of the spirited young woman she had been, her body grew more fragile with each passing day, her skin pale, her strength fading. He sat with her in silence. He carried her when she could no longer walk. He watched the woman he had loved for over 50 years slip slowly away, and on November 3rd, 1926, Annie Oakley passed away. 18 days later, unable to bear the weight of her absence, Frank Butler died too. Some say he died of grief. Others say he simply followed her, wherever she had gone. Now, side by side, in a quiet cemetery, their names are etched into stone. But in the soft morning light, where a single ray of sun shines down between the trees, it's easy to believe they're not gone at all. They are still together, as partners in the arena, as companions in life, and now as spirits united once more. If you'd like to see more videos like Annie Oakley, The Journey Begins, please like and subscribe to this channel. Stay tuned for more videos.